Thanks everybody for coming. I appreciate that this is the last session of the day, so I'll try and make this lively and short. One addition, I'm actually on the move. I'm happy to announce that I will be joining Bocconi University in Milan in next February, so I'm actually going full circle and going into the social sciences. Okay, so my talk is about biases in NLP. Initially, the title I gave was Bias in NLP, but then I thought a little more about it, and I was like, there's actually more than one. So what is that? Well, if we do NLP, we take some data, we stick it into our NLP model, and then out comes some kind of great analysis or a classification or whatever other wonderful thing we want. Now, there's several things that influence this outcome or this whole process. There is the selection of the data that influences how we can train our model with that data. There is the annotation or the coding that we provide that influences a lot of the outcome. Then there's the choice of the model and how we treat the model that influences it. And last but not least, there's the whole issue of how we conceive of an experiment, of a model, of a task, and why we do it. So what I want to do today is give a very brief overview of where I think all these biases come from, and then go through these four different ones: selection, annotation, models, and design bias, and talk briefly about, in more depth, what it is, and show some solution as to how we can address it. I will give examples pretty much only of the works that I've been involved with. That doesn't mean that there is more. There's a lot of really great work of addressing bias. I started adding more of them in, and then I gave up because, in the interest of time, and because I didn't feel comfortable, not misrepresenting other people's ideas. But do go ahead and read them, and ask me if you want more information. So whence the bias? Well, because people. And yes, I'm aware this is not grammatically correct, but trust me, I'm a linguist. So one of these people is Claude Shannon, who apparently was a lot of fun at parties if he had gone, but he didn't. He stayed home and he played a game with his wife. He said, okay, I'm going to give you a starting word, and then you guess the next word, and I'll see whether I can guess what word you were going to guess. So he'd say, okay, what's the next word? My. She'd be like, I don't know, hovercraft. And they kept playing that for a whole night, and she would like dutifully come up with the next words. And Shannon was like, this is great. So now I can actually predict what the next word is, and I can measure it. And he came up with entropy, and I'm not going to knock entropy. We've heard more about this this morning by Simon, wherever he sits now, there. Yeah. And it has enabled a lot of great things. For example, NLP, among other things, and information retrieval. But it has sort of had one problem, namely that it narrowed our focus to language as a source of information that can be measured. The problem is language is a lot of things, among them information, but also a lot of other things. And one of the main things that language is also is about self-representation. And again, this is where people come into the whole bias thing. Because people don't just produce language in a vacuum. People produce language to communicate with other people who also use language, to also communicate their ideas and goals and information. So the whole thing becomes pretty complex. And when we talk to these other people, we use language that is sort of directed at them and has certain characteristics. And if we talk to other people, then maybe we use slightly different language. For example, I'm going to talk to you now much different than I will talk much later in a pub, for example, or at a birthday party or something like that. So looking at how people speak in certain contexts and within certain groups tells us something about how language is used. It can help us infer something about the speaker because they're representing themselves as part of these groups. And these groups could be, for example, socio-demographic attributes like age, gender, education, the region they're from, and a lot of other things. And this basically makes language no longer about information, but about a social construct and about what we do with it. And luckily, in NLP, there has been an ongoing revolution. There's a lot of people who have worked on this. Some of them are sitting in this room, that we can basically both infer something about the person that is uttering something and about their socio-demographic makeup, but also use that information to inform our models a little more. However, that's still not entirely the mainstream. What still is sort of the mainstream is this, oh, all language is the same and it's all about information, there's no difference. What that entails is basically that if you have language that is very close to your training data, that is very standard, then you will probably get the correct analysis, for example, the parts of speech. If you get something that's a lot further away from that standard, and that is actually what people use on the internets, you probably get the wrong interpretation, right? And, well, that's kind of academically vexing and a little bit of a problem, but we've seen that this distance from the standard actually correlates strongly with demographics. And that has some consequences, namely that if we look at the population as a whole in all its glory, NLP only works well for a very, very small slice of the population. And by the way, it looks pretty much like me. Middle-aged, white, male, highly educated, speaks sort of American English. If you are not within that group, then, well, you know, caveats apply. So the question is, what can we do about it? My goal today is to look at each of these biases that contribute to this problem that we have and see how we can address them and what we can do. So let's start with data and with the selection bias. When we do NLP these days, we basically do some form of machine learning. And when we do that, we're basically doing statistics, where we're sampling a lot of instances, and we're hoping that that sort of gives us an intuition of the underlying distribution, and then we can model that. The problem is that we might be sampling in the wrong space. For example, the Wall Street Journal is not really representative of the population as a whole. And that means if we sample from this, we might get a very, very different image of how language works than if we only looked at the first one. Not doing that has a couple of consequences, the main one of them being exclusion. So if we don't model a demographics group's language, they will not benefit from NLP and they will effectively be excluded from its benefits. We looked at several parts of speech taggers on a sample of tweets that contained markers of African American vernacular English, something like street being written as screet or brother as brother. And there's a couple of other interesting things, morphosyntactically, phonologically. You can talk to Jacob there, who's done a lot of more work on that. And we found that on average, these POS taggers got accuracy of 72.66. That's not really great, not something to write home about. Some were better, some were worse. We said, well, maybe this is just because it's Twitter, and Twitter is very different from everything else. Well, no, if we only look at the tweets that don't contain African American vernacular English markers, the performance goes up on average over all these three different POS taggers. So that's a problem if we have a whole ethnic group that, you know, uses a specific kind of language regularly on the internet, and we're just performing really badly on it. That's a problem. There's also a regional component to it. We kind of measured the average log likelihood per word that these taggers assign to the tweets, and then we mapped back where these tweets came from. And basically, the purpler or redder, the worse the performance, or the worse the log likelihood. And what we see is that this sort of, you know, gets worse in the southeast of the US, and it so happens that that is also one of the areas that has a higher population of African Americans that use African American vernacular English. So we're excluding, you know, people based on their ethnolect, but also this affects sort of entire regions potentially. We did another study where we looked at age. We trained, again, several POS taggers and then tested it on English and German data from two age groups, over 45 and under 35. And then what we saw was that the age groups under 35, the performance was significantly worse. Not a lot, but significant. And since POS tagging is one of the first steps, having 2 percentage points more or less does count in the end, right? And it just is annoying if you have, like, you know, 2 more words wrong than the other person. This is actually an interesting linguistic effect. The data this was trained on is the Wall Street Journal from the 80s and 90s, and that is from that period when the formative years of the older age group were, linguistically speaking. So we see some language change at work. However, there is a bad news coming, namely more than half of the world's population right now are under 35. So essentially we're excluding, more than half of the world's population. That's not really a good business model for any discipline. So we should not be doing this. So maybe here's an idea. What about if we could include the demographic information in the text representations? So how do we do that? Well, how does anyone do anything these days? Via embeddings. Embeddings can pick up on the sort of biases that we have in the data, but maybe that is also a good thing. Maybe we want that. So what I did is I basically separated my data into two groups, either by age or by gender. I then balanced them out because embeddings are very sensitive to the amount of available data. And then I also created a control group. And basically on these three corpora, trained word embeddings with word2vec. And then I basically tested these two systems in a setup where we take the agnostic word embeddings on some training data, train a model, and then we have the age-specific or gender-specific word embeddings, and we train them on specific data. And at test time, and this is the big caveat, we basically say, let me take the classifier that was trained specifically for this age or gender group. And we see how that performs. The data I chose was some review data in 5 different language varieties over 3 different tasks. There was a lot of data available. It differs in the amount of labels and sort of the kinds of tasks that we're trying to solve. But what we see throughout in the outcome is if we have a model that has access to age information, it does better on all 3 tasks: sentiment analysis, topic prediction, and gender classification. The same holds if we have a model that has access to gender information, and again, this is only through the embeddings being trained on that specific subcorpus. Again, we see statistically significant, oftentimes better performance across all the 5 language varieties. This is averaged over all 5 languages. So that's pretty good news. That means if we can give our models, our NLP models, some inkling of the underlying demographics of the speaker, then they can do better. They can leverage that information. By the way, there's a lot of confounding factors, label distribution and whatnot. Men and women talk about very different things in reviews. I try to even those out as much as possible, so that shouldn't factor into it. The big caveat is, of course, that we assumed we know who the speaker is at test time, right? So what do we do if we don't know that? I'll get back to that. Let's put a pin in it for now. The other kind of annotation is something we heard about before this morning. Ken was talking about it, don't see him right now, namely annotation bias. What do we do if we have a bunch of items and we have some annotators and ask them, is this, I don't know, a positive instance of some phenomenon that I'm investigating, right? And some people say yes, some people say no. How do we come up with one label, or do we even want one label? So the main problem is we want to know how much we can trust each of these annotators, right? And the other one is we would like to sort of aggregate all their answers into one that we can give to a model. So these two problems kind of depend on each other a little bit in a circular motion. If we knew all the competence estimates for the people, then we could just, sort of take a weighted average and get the correct answer. If we knew the correct answers, we could assign the competence estimates by just checking how many people got right. But typically, we don't know one or the other. So what do we do? Well, let's find out who's reliable. The way you do that is you basically assume there is a truth out there, and you have your annotators. And some of these annotators are experts, and they will just write down the truth. They know what the truth is, and they will just put it down on paper or text. Some of them have no idea what they're doing, so they will just randomly follow some strategy and pick a label that they like. And what you get in your 6 answers or 10 answers or however many annotations you asked for is just a corruption of the truth, and you just have to unscramble that process. We wrote a tool called MACE, multi-annotator competence estimation, that you can freely download theoretically from this website, but I recently heard that it's badly maintained and you can't download it, so you can go to my website and download it there. The question is, of course, does it work, right? Can we actually learn something? We downloaded some data sets from Snow et al. Where we knew the correct answer theoretically, and we had some annotations for it. Again, these are 3 different tasks with different amounts of items and annotators. And first we wanted to see if our model says, I trust this person, this is a reliable annotator, does it correlate with their proficiency, with the number of items they get right? And what we see, we can compare it with the raw agreement of annotators and their competence, their kappa, and then what our model says. And we basically see throughout, yes, the model does better than these other measures, and it's consistently high correlation, Spearman-Pearson correlation of 90 and above means there's a pretty strong correlation. If somebody is good, then they also get a high rating. Anecdotally, I was running this model on a task where we had 700 annotators, and like after the first 5 hours, I sort of ran it, looked at the top 5 and the bottom 5 annotators, and it also turned out that the bottom 5 had not followed the annotation guidelines. The top 5 produced very, very good things, and then you can use that to basically, ban the bad apples immediately and reassign people to that task. But you can also give bonuses to the people who are really good. And at least it's theoretically objective. So then the question is, okay, if we do this, how well do we do in finding the correct answer for each item? And we see that basically our model in pink does a lot better than majority voting, where you just go with whatever the majority of your annotators say, or performs equally well in the case of word sense disambiguation, which apparently was just so easy that there wasn't much way of getting it wrong. We wanted to go a little deeper and say, well, maybe we can use entropy, right? We heard about that before. Entropy can measure how difficult an item is. We now have a sense of how good our annotators are. If good annotators, 3 good annotators disagree on an item, maybe it's a hard item. Maybe we don't want items that are very difficult. We can throw away some of the items if we get better annotations. So we said, okay, if we have high entropy, that means the model is not very confident in the solution that we get. Maybe we can throw those out and see what that does for our accuracy. Turns out if we do that, works really well. With majority voting, what people do is they say, I only want items where at least 9 annotators, 8 annotators, 7, 6, 5 agree. If you do that, you lose a lot of the items. Your accuracy goes up here on the y-axis, but you throw away a lot of the corpus, up to 50%, right? And if we use our model, you can basically get a much smoother curve. You can determine beforehand how much of the data you want to forego, but at any level you basically get improved performance. We also looked at what Ken talked about this morning. If you have control items, gold items, where you know what the answer is, naturally if you give a model an inkling of, on this answer, I expect the annotator to say X, and then they don't do it, that should give the model a pretty good clue. Turns out it does. If we use control items, pretty much at any level of control items we want to give it. You probably don't want to annotate 80% of your data yourself as control items, but even in the beginning, you get a good gain if you provide the models with it. Okay, so that's nice. That's a good tool. We can learn who we can trust and sort of account for some of the bias in the annotations. But maybe there's another thing. Maybe we can also keep the uncertainty. We can keep the fact that good annotators sometimes disagree, because maybe there are several good answers. There is not one truth. So we had this example earlier today where you have sort of several answers for the same item. We found that we looked into 2 corpora. We looked at phrases, these 2, Nokia D5000 and love his version. And people have, slightly different ways of annotating them with parts of speech. Now you can have a spirited linguistic discussion about which way is better. There is no good way of settling it as long as it's consistent. So what we said was, maybe we can just tell our model that it's okay to not be sure for certain items, right? There are some hard categories. So we find that pronouns and nouns and determiners and pronouns and numbers and nouns are oftentimes confused by annotators. So it's okay if the model doesn't get those right. However, there are other categories that annotators always agree on. They never get that wrong. Nobody confuses a noun for a verb, for example. right? So we can have these confusion matrices, and we can give that to the model. And we say, well, while we're training the model, if the model makes a mistake on one of the easy cases, then we just do a normal update and we move the model away from that decision. If it makes a wrong decision on a difficult case, it confuses two of these things that annotators, that humans also confuse frequently, we say that's okay, right? We'll make a slight update, but we'll temper it by the amount of confusion that annotators have for these items. So very confusable items, we'll make a very small update. Items that are less confusable, we make a slightly bigger update. Does it help? Well, yes, for part of speech tagging, it does help. Here we see like 3 different data sets. On the x-axis, you have the number of iterations that we ran the model for. And you basically see that typically preserving this uncertainty and this knowledge that people sometimes disagree on solutions helps. We can actually carry that forward in the model and have a little better performance. All right. So we've covered the selection bias, the annotation bias, and the data. Let's move into the models. Why are models biased? Well, because they make 2 assumptions. I'm anthropomorphizing my models. I shouldn't do that, but I like to do it. So models assume what they see is representative. This data represents the world. This is something we computer scientists are really bad at. Social scientists are really good. They have like a sample size of 16, but they've really carefully selected all the people and all the examples they want to have in there, and it is representative, whereas Twitter, for example, rarely is. However, the model also assumes that what I get is reliable. And I've just shown you in the last 2 parts that, no, the selection bias means this thing is not representative, and the annotation bias means this is probably not reliable. Okay, so another idea. How about we just tell the model that there's a demographic component that can sort of skew things, and it shouldn't rely too much on the data. It should sort of incorporate that knowledge in the model. And this is where the pin comes back. Namely, we don't need to know at test time what it is. We need to tell the model, look, there's age and gender and other things, and they can be dimensions of variation for language. If you learn how things vary along that during training, you don't even have to know it at test time what the person is. You just know that language works in a certain way. The motivation for that was that I was at a workshop where we looked at mental health. Can we predict mental health risks from social media data? We discussed this briefly today before. The answer is yes, you can. However, the one thing that is often left unaccounted is the fact that mental health conditions don't occur in isolation. If you are depressed, maybe you also have PTSD or anxiety. These things are comorbid. They often occur together. What's more is they also correlate strongly with demographic factors. Men are much more likely to get PTSD. Women are much more likely to get eating disorders. So taking that into account can actually help you. And that's exactly what psychologists do. If somebody walks into their practice, they will assess who this is, how old are they, where they're from, what is their education level, gender, background, and so on and so forth. So we had some data that was carefully controlled. So this is not a representative sample of the world, I should say, but it sort of covered 8 different mental health conditions, plus neurotypicality, meaning no condition, just free from any conditions. And for about 1/10 of the data, we also had gender information. We knew whether this was a man or a woman. And this data came from a company called Quantify. What we then did is we built a model, and I don't want to go into details, but we built a multitask learning model that tried to predict all of these things at the same time. Here's sort of what the standard model does. If you just learn each of the tasks individually, you get sort of a mixed performance. If you have this multitask model that learns to predict all of the different mental health conditions at once, it can sort of bootstrap itself and see that there are these comorbidity effects, and it does significantly better. But the nice thing is, once we add gender into the mix as another auxiliary task, the model actually learns that there are these differences in between how people learn language and how that correlates with certain mental health conditions. And the really nice thing about this is it's not just a better number and you can get an EACL paper out of it. You can also look at it and you can say the difference between these 2 models is the difference between 120 at-risk patients for suicide diagnosed correctly or not, right? So better models can actually mean a real difference in the world. And if we can account for demographic bias, maybe we can get there. So let me get to the last part, which is design bias. So design bias, just to bring that back, is how we think about language and how we address NLP. The problem in the world is that we want to work on different languages, but not all languages are created equal, at least not in terms of resources, right? So it's very, very easy to work on English. It's a lot harder to work on Danish. I can tell you from experience. Actually, Danish is hard in any case, but. So we did a little study on a random sample of languages that you find on Twitter. These are not like obscure languages where we, scoured some linguistics textbooks and said like, oh, what's the weirdest language that you've never heard about? These are languages that are on Twitter. For that sample, only about a third actually had tree banks available, syntactic information, so that you can train a model to syntactically analyze that language. So for 2/3 of the languages on Twitter, we couldn't do a syntactic analysis, even if we wanted to. If you want to go into semantics and look at like word nets or something like that, it gets even worse. You only have about 10%, a little more than 10%, right? So if you happen to speak a language or want to work on a language for which there is no tree bank and no semantic resource, then you have a huge problem getting started and evaluating your model. You basically have to resort to unsupervised training, maybe semi-supervised training, and it's a huge headache. So what happens? Most people don't work on it, right? There are languages on the Indian subcontinent, like Telugu, that have like 35 million speakers. Nobody works on them, right? That's like 7 times the population of Denmark, right? Nobody works on these languages because it's too hard to get started. It's much easier to build a POS tagger for English, and so that's what we do. And this is the problem, the flip side of overexposure. If I tell you about 2 cities, let's say New York and Lagos, most people say, where the hell is Lagos? It's in Nigeria. But if I ask you which city is bigger, the first assumption is, oh, it must be New York. Now, obviously, you know that this is a trick question, so you know it's not New York. But you know how many people live in Lagos? Well, roughly twice as many as in New York City. Right? The thing is, we have just heard about New York City so many more times that we automatically assume there must be something to it. Right? This is the availability bias, and we always assume something that we know is bigger, better, faster, more dangerous, more anything. So why am I telling you about this? A, because it's interesting, but B, because it affects how we work. Right? Do we work on American English or Scottish English? Do we work on POS tagging or discourse? Right? Which of these things have you seen more often in papers? If you're a grad student in your first year and you sort of leaf through what's going on in the field, you're naturally going to gravitate to the things that you see more, that you can build off of, right? And there is no ill will behind this, and it actually takes a lot of effort to catch yourself in this bias, but it exists, right? And it's kind of self-perpetuating. There's a last problem, and that is dual use. We have a lot of great NLP technologies, right? Authorship attribution, text classification, shown you a couple of examples here, personalization tools, and they can be used for great purposes, right? We can look at historical documents and decide whether something was written by Shakespeare or not. We can do sentiment analysis and find out, whether people like our new product. And we can improve the user experience on Google, Facebook, whatever, by personalizing it to their specific niche. However, we can use exactly the same tools to suppress dissenting opinions, to find out who it is, to censor them, to hound them down. And this is a lot more benign, but still bad. We can tailor ads and like pester people with trips to Mallorca or whatever that they never wanted. So there's no idea here. I don't have a solution for this because this is not an easy fix. This is something that this is the only thing we can do is what we're doing right here, like talks like the 2 we heard in the last session, right? Going out, being honest about it, acknowledging that we might have a problem and we need to think about these things. Having a discussion also with your stakeholders, your students, companies that you might consult with. You can put in your paper a disclaimer saying, hey, here's this great tool that lets you do X. By the way, you might use X for your own purposes and they're probably bad. be aware that, now this is out there. So the good thing is somebody who wants to prevent themselves from X now also knows what you might be doing. But there is no easy fits all. However, I wanted to, end on a somewhat lighter note. So what are we going to do moving forward? Well, one thing is we have to tackle language change. Language varies along all these different dimensions: age, gender, education, ethnicity, and many more. Who knows how many are out there? So we need to find that out. And we need to kind of find a way to incorporate that more intelligently into our models, because we can't have subsampled models for each of these intersections of the Venn diagrams, because then we'd have hundreds of models in every language for every domain that we want to do, and because language changes over time, we have to do it, I don't know, probably even more frequently than every year, like every few months. We also need to learn or find out, with the help of sociolinguists, because they've been doing this for centuries, which demographic factors influence which levels of linguistic analysis, and how that factors into our NLP models, and how we can make it better to address demographic bias. Because right now, what we're doing in NLP is a little bit like the drunk guy searching for his keys under a street lamp, because that's where the light is. That's not where the keys are, right? We are solving pos tagging over and over again. Nobody ever asked us for that, right? Pos tagging is great, don't get me wrong. But maybe we should, affix the light of the lamp and, look a little further outside, because there's other things, and there might be keys to how we solve language that we haven't thought about yet. So let me end with the what can we do with the different biases. If we have problems with selection bias and overfitting, we can regularize, we can use priors, we can sample our data up and down. With the annotation, we have skewed labels, we can use annotation models and disagreement weighting. If we have model bias, we can use dummy labels, we can weight the errors differently, we can have confidence thresholds, or we can include information as a component into the model. And the problems with the research design that I've talked about can only be solved by, well, talking about it. So please, by all means, go forward and talk more about bias in NLP. And if we do that, I think we can achieve three things. One, we can have a fairer NLP for everybody. We can open up new possibilities to personalize NLP tools to people with different language specifications. And we can improve the performance across the board so that everybody actually benefits from NLP, not just a chosen few. And that's it. Thank you very much. Shameless plug, if you know anybody who is interested in a PhD or a postdoc, you or somebody else, contact me. I have positions to fill in 2018.